Cheers.
Okay, and let me just give you a little intro here. So thank you all for attending the Philosophy of Contemporary and Future Science seminar series. Today we are joined by Helen Meskhidze. Helen is a PhD candidate at the University of California, Irvine. She works on the epistemology of computer simulations as well as the foundations of gravitational theories. She received an MA from Western University in Ontario and a BA and BS in philosophy and physics, respectively, from Elon University in 2016. Today, Helen will be talking to us. We'll be giving a talk entitled, "What Do We Learn from Code Comparisons? A Case Study of Self-Interacting Dark Matter Implementations." Helen, thank you for joining us, and take it away.
Thank you all so much for inviting me to join and present in part of this seminar series. So yeah, I'll be talking about code comparisons today and looking at a case study that I was part of. Okay, so let's get started. So there's been a lot of philosophers of science concerned about how we trust models. And this dates back to Levins's 1966 paper, where he discusses how we can increase our trust by relying on a method called robustness analysis. And what he says is that robustness analysis can show us whether a result depends on the essentials of the model or some kind of details of the simplifying assumptions. This is accomplished by studying a number of similar but distinct models of the same phenomenon of interest. And as he puts it quite famously, our truth is at the intersection of many independent lies, where these independent lies are the various models that are approximating or idealizing in different ways. Similarly, Wimsatt argues that the goal of robustness analysis is to separate the scientifically important aspects and predictions of our models from the illusory ones that are just accidents of our representations. Since then, Orszag and Stober have disagreed, and they argued that robustness analysis, the way that it's been presented and discussed thus far, has been in a kind of non-empirical theory confirmation way, and they're really critical of that. So they point out that robustness analysis is talking about analyzing models and not necessarily even comparing them to data. And so the idea is, because you're not sensitive to the data, when you're doing the robustness analysis, you're doing non-empirical theory confirmation. And then finally, Michael Weisberg has defended robustness analysis against the critiques of Orszag and Stober, and he argues that because we can identify robust theorems, and once we've done so, we can show that the theorems have a degree of confirmation, and we don't have to worry about having direct empirical evidence for their truth. So we can use robustness analysis to identify these kinds of robust theorems. On the physics side of things, robustness, or at least on the astrophysics side of things, robustness often goes under the name of numerical convergence. So here's this famous paper by Power et al. That will become a case study later, but it's entitled "The Inner Structure of Lambda Cold Dark Matter Halos," and they do a numerical convergence kind of study. And this paper has over 1,000 citations, and people in the field tend to really respect numerical convergence results. There's a paper from 2020 by Marie Gueguen where she investigates robustness through this kind of convergence analysis in the cosmological context. And what she's looking at is a really on-the-ground kind of robustness analysis. Like, what are the physicists themselves doing when they're doing this kind of analysis? And she uses this project by Van den Bosch and Ogaya to argue that convergence, and thus robustness in astrophysics, is insufficient to establish trust in simulations. So Van den Bosch and Ogaya showed that this whole slew of seemingly independent and body simulations were subject to the same numerical artifact. And so all of them suffered a kind of issue of over-merging. And so even though the results they were getting were robust across all the different simulations, because they had this artifact at play, in fact, you weren't able to increase your trust in the results of the simulations. So in short, robustness was not sufficient to increase trust. Okay. And then this critique about robustness that Marie waged has gathered a lot of, has spurred a lot of people to kind of respond to it. So there's a paper by Peter Matteg where he argues that material measurements have higher epistemic standing than simulations, and so maybe we should be talking about those. Florian Boge argues that we need to be more specific in what we're asking to trust simulations for. And so what he does is categorize types of robustness that we might desire, and then look at how each of those kinds of robustness sanctions trust in different ways. And then finally, a more recent paper by Kevin Katawaki looks at the long history of simulations and argues that simulation verification and validation happens throughout the development of a simulation. So it's really important, he says, to be tuned to how the process unfolds when you're developing the simulation, and then being sensitive to that history really helps you understand where the trust in the simulation results comes from the physicist's side. And then one other paper I want to mention, because I'll go into a little bit more detail about their argument, is this paper by Johannes Leonard and Eric Winsberg, where they argue that climate models, and I would say that astrophysical models would be a very similar case, suffer a kind of confirmation holism. And it would seem to me, at least, that this kind of confirmation holism is going to undercut our ability to establish robust results, because we kind of accept the models all at once. So let me say a little bit more about what their argument is. So they say that these kinds of climate models have fuzzy modularity and a kludged together kind of nature, and this is what leads to the confirmation holism. So the fuzzy modularity is this idea that you don't have a fully modular computer program. You have fuzzy modularity in the sense that each of the modules can stand alone, but they're often sending each other information and data. And so they're still interconnected in this kind of way. The kludging aspect is more from computer science. So a kludge is, they call it an inelegant, botched together piece of a program, something functional, but somehow it's messy and unsatisfying. And so it's, in principle, of course, it's possible to rebuild these programs from scratch, but this kind of clean state implementation is not really a practical option, they say. And so they say, like, these climate models they're looking at are fuzzy, have fuzzy modularity, and seem to be kludged together. And this is what leads to a holistic confirmation. So this undercuts our ability to develop analytic understanding, so to tease apart the sources of success and failure of a simulation. And instead what we have is an all-at-once confirmation. And so I'd say, because we have this all-at-once kind of confirmation, having robust results doesn't really track in this kind of framework. You just get holistic confirmation of the simulation itself. And I'll also note that they're arguing this on a priori grounds, as well as then showing it with the case study. And so what I want to do is show another case study in the talk that will kind of show that you might be able to get away with having fuzzy modularity and a kludged together program, but there might be other ways that you don't have to buy into holistic confirmation. Okay. So we've considered different ways of increasing our trust in simulations, and robustness analysis is kind of one of them. Another method, though, that Marie Gueguen has also published on are these code comparisons. These are comparisons of the outputs of various computer simulation codes for the same or very similar kinds of setups. In a forthcoming paper, she looks at these kinds of code comparisons, and she argues that the diversity of codes that you need to get such a comparison off the ground is going to undermine the ability to actually compare the results of the simulations themselves. So in other words, if we have the diversity to do a successful comparison, we won't be able to compare the outputs of the codes because they'll be sufficiently dissimilar, and so we wouldn't be able to bring them into contact. On the flip side, if we do bring them into contact, then we won't have the necessary diversity that we need. Okay, so code comparisons also have a long history in astrophysics. So the first one that I found, at least, dates back to this paper by Lecar from 1968, where he's comparing the treatment of a collapsing 25-body system in 11 different codes. The most famous early code comparison, though, I think is by the Santa Barbara Code Comparison Cluster from 1999. And there they compare the results of 12 codes when they're simulating an X-ray cluster with cold dark matter. And this combination is thought to have demonstrated the benefits of adopting the same initial conditions across a wide variety of codes and then comparing the results. Okay, so our question in this collaboration was, can we design a code comparison methodology that's going to avoid the pitfalls that Gueguen outlines, namely the diversity versus the comparability trade-off, but also will yield scientific results? So that's kind of the question in the background. The outline for this talk is that I'll first overview Gueguen's argument to give you a better sense of how she's making this point. Then I'll go over how we designed our code comparison. So a little bit of background on self-interacting dark matter simulations, our proposed methodology, the results of the comparison, and then I'll circle back to these philosophical questions on code comparison methodology. The claim in the broadest sense is that code comparisons can increase our confidence in simulations. And the way that they're going to do so is not by asking them to do robustness analysis, but rather by asking them to be part of a process of eliminative reasoning. And I'll discuss what I mean by that towards the end as well. Okay, so let me go into Gueguen's argument. So she argues that a successful code comparison is going to try to establish that a simulation is artifact-free. So you can see how she's motivated by her previous paper about robustness to say, okay, can a code comparison do what we thought robustness was doing? And she says to do so, it has to satisfy this comparability and the diversity requirement. So the code outputs have to be comparable and the codes have to be diverse enough to rule out the artifacts that we're trying to rule out. Then she looks at what are two main code comparison methodologies used in astrophysics, and these are exemplified by the Aquila comparison group and the Agora collaboration. So let me go into what those methodologies are, and then we'll return to her argument. The Aquila comparison project, their goal is to allow each code to perform at its very best. And so what they say is, you can take whatever initial conditions you prefer and whatever physics modules you want to implement to each of these groups, and then we'll compare what we get out at the end. So it should be very clear, like the diversity is definitely there because each code gets to decide what physics it's even implementing. However, the results of these comparisons are not easily comparable. Like, each code would bring its results and none of them agreed and nobody knew why or what to do about it. And so this comparison methodology didn't really work in the way that they expected. So there was no convergence because the physics implemented by each code was just not the same. I do think it was a really fruitful methodology, but I think it was fruitful for different reasons. It allowed them to say things like, what about if we increase the feedback in this code? What kind of results did it have? What kind of influence did it have on the results? And then say, okay, what if we did it in this other code? What kind of influence did it have? But it's not that the results are comparable in that case. More what you're looking for is the change in the trends. And so it doesn't really do the ruling out of artifacts that you want, but it still can be a really fruitful methodology. The other methodology was exemplified by the Agora project. So here the goal was make everything as similar as possible. So adopt identical initial conditions, have some kind of common analysis platform at the end where you pull the results into, and then you're able to compare them straightforwardly. So I think it's, again, clear that this one is comparable, but you don't have sufficient diversity. And the reason you don't have sufficient diversity is because you forced the codes to be as similar as possible while still being, different codes. So the idea here was that the effort to make the comparison possible is going to be in tension with the diversity required to search for these kinds of robust properties and exclude sources of artifacts. Just to like highlight a particular example, so you might wonder, how do you know that it's not the common analysis platform that's generating the agreement between the codes as opposed to the code outputs themselves? Because you've introduced this new factor, you're not quite sure you have a full grasp of it or handle on it. Okay, so we've looked at those two methodologies, and then Gueguen argues that neither methodology produces a code comparison that satisfies comparability and diversity. And she thus argues that neither methodology can establish that the codes examined are artifact-free indeed. Okay, so that's the overview of her argument. Now I'm going to talk about how we designed our code comparison methodology. We wanted to focus on a scientifically relevant kind of question and then run a code comparison within that question. And so the results that I'll show you are kind of twofold. So we have main science results, and then we also have the philosophical argument. So I'll give you this background on self-interacting dark matter simulations with the idea that I'll get you like in the mindset of somebody working with self-interacting dark matter today, and then hopefully it'll be clear like why the kinds of questions we're asking are fruitful ones in the scientific context. Okay, so in the 1980s, this paradigm of cold dark matter was proposed, and this is like non-electromagnetic matter that exists in the universe, as in it doesn't interact with light. And it's cold in the sense that it's cold, it's not interacting. In the 1990s, these simulations became fine enough to resolve the inner structure of halos that required these cold dark matter models. But a lot of small-scale problems started to emerge. Basically, you had these issues where the density profiles of your halos were not like when you did the simulations, they didn't match what you observed. Or you would have this problem where you would have a low number of observed luminous galaxies, satellite galaxies, but you were thinking that you would have much more from your based on your simulation results. Or even this last one, the too big to fail, says that in those dark matter substructures, you should be getting more stars than we actually observe, but we don't observe that many. So a lot of kind of small scale problems, and by small scale, I mean at the galaxy scale, started to emerge in the 1990s. And also in the 1990s, dark matter with self-interactions was proposed. And self-interactions is just dark matter that's able to impact itself. And so when it, for example, collides with itself, what happens in the scattering that happens with that was something that they were trying to model. It wasn't until 2000 that two cosmologists proposed self-interactions in response to these kinds of small-scale challenges. And so what they were doing was putting together these two ideas and saying, well, in body simulations seem like you're having these small-scale challenges. I wonder if the self-interactions would help resolve them. And the reason you might think that they would resolve them is because self-interactions allow the energy to move from the really central region of a dark matter halo outwards. And so they're able to distribute the energy a little bit more throughout the halo. In the 2010s, SIDM, self-interacting dark matter, is indeed shown to alleviate some of those small-scale challenges, but not all of them. So there remain some small-scale challenges. And then late 2010s into today, a lot of baryonic physics is being incorporated into self-interacting dark matter simulations, as in people are caring about hydrodynamics and how do you model self-interacting dark matter and hydrodynamics together. Also, velocity-dependent cross-sections and inelastic or dissipative SIDM formulations are being tested. So before, where elastic collisions were the only ones that were going on, here they're looking at, okay, what about inelastic collisions? Or the velocity-dependent cross-section refers to if you have velocities of particles that are colliding, at what distance are they going to interact with each other and how that might depend on the velocity of the particles themselves. Okay, so that's a little bit of the history. The main question that SIDM researchers are faced with today is at what range these dark matter particles should interact, whether this should be a fixed range or a velocity dependent range. And so this gets the technical way this gets cashed out is the sigma over m parameter. And so they say, should this be a fixed parameter or a velocity dependent kind of parameter? On the galaxy scale, it seems like this parameter should take the value of like 1 to 2 centimeters squared per gram, and that's going to solve a lot of those small scale problems I referred to earlier. However, if you zoom out from the galaxy to the cluster of galaxy scales, then it seems like 0.1 centimeters squared per gram is preferred, and in fact, 1 centimeter squared per gram cross-section is ruled out based on observations at the cluster scale, so at the larger scale. And so you have this kind of issue in terms of how we model self-interacting dark matter in these simulations, and you're not sure what kind of cross-section value to adopt in your simulations. Okay, so with this background about self-interactions, I'll now turn to presenting the two codes that we're actually comparing. The two codes we're comparing, both of them started as one code called Gadget. Gadget evolved into Gadget 2, which then branched into Gizmo and a repo. I'll skip that. Okay, so Gizmo, it used to be the case that these kinds of codes, there were two main methods of doing it. First, you could do particle-particle methods. So each of so you would kind of split off your simulation volume, and you'd have particles that all interacted with one another that had energies, masses, velocities, etc. attached to them. The other way that you could do it was a mesh, where you'd lay a mesh across your simulation volume and then track how the energy flowed in the mesh. Nowadays, they're much more similar, like the two kinds of methods. And so Gizmo is a little bit more akin to this particle kind of method. It uses a meshless finite mass, finite volume method, where the fundamental elements are cells of finite mass and volume, and these represent the particles distributed throughout the simulation volume. For a repo, on the other hand, you have a moving unstructured mesh where the simulation volume is partitioned into non-regular finite volume cells, and then the cells are allowed to move and deform continuously. So the differences between the particle and the mesh method were at first really significant, like in the 1990s, but nowadays they've become a lot closer in terms of their methodology. They still do things slightly differently though, and we'll see that when I'm just about to present how they do self-interaction. So hopefully that will become clear in a second. So when you're doing these self-interacting dark matter simulations, you need to calculate the probability that these particles will actually interact with one another. So here's how you do it. You want to calculate the probability, and that's Pij. And it's a function of the cross-section that I mentioned earlier, the mass, the velocities of the two particles that might be colliding, Gij, which is it accounts for the overlap in the smoothing kernels of the particles, which won't be so important for us. And you do this at each time, so you step through time. And then you calculate that probability, and then you still have to decide whether the particles will actually interact or not, and you do that by drawing a random number from a uniform distribution in the interval 0 to 1. If an interaction does take place, the particles are given outgoing velocities consistent with elastic scattering in our case. And these outgoing velocities are determined by the center of mass velocity of the two particles that were incoming, their masses, and their relative speed. The direction, though, is chosen at random, just as long as one particle is moving opposite the other. So that's how you do it in Gizmo. In a repo, remember, it's more of a mesh kind of system. So what you do is you calculate the probability of scattering of a particle with its k nearest neighbors. So you look at the nearest neighbors around it. And by default, you look at the nearest 32 neighbors. and you calculate the probability of scattering with those. So same Pij, you can see the equation looks really similar to the previous one. So you still have that cross-section, mass, velocity, and you're stepping through time. The only difference is this cubic spline kernel function. And this is just meant to center the mass of the particle in the cell that it's in. And so it's kind of like you're simulating a particle inside of the cell, but it's also kind of like you have a cell as your most basic unit. Okay, so again, you still have to decide if they interact, and this works pretty much the same way as it did in Gizmo. The direction is again chosen at random, but each particle moves opposite the other. So our main scientific question was, given how each code implements self-interacting dark matter, what differences, if any, are going to arise between the predictions of the codes? As I was researching for this project, I came across this paper, this review paper by Helen and Yu in 2017, and they say, quote, "It's unknown what differences, if any, may arise from the various methods." And by methods, they're talking about the particle-based methods versus the mesh-based methods. And I just thought that was a funny way of summarizing the state of the field. They just have no idea whether or not there would be any differences that arise between these methods when you're doing self-interacting dark matter simulations. Okay, so that covers the background on self-interacting dark matter simulations. So now I'll talk about what our proposed methodology was. So our team consisted of two philosophers, myself and Jim Weatherall at UCI. And then we also had a bunch of astronomers, cosmologists, and physicists. So James Bullock is the dean of the School of Physical Sciences and also a professor in the Department of Physics and Astronomy at UCI. And he was our main contact for getting the project off the ground. Manoj Kaplingha is also a professor in the Physics and Astronomy Department at UCI. Francisco Mercado is a graduate student at UCI in the same department. Victor Robles was a postdoc at UCI, but he's now a postdoc at Yale. And Omid Sameh was our only contact for a repo at first, because a repo was not public source when we started this project. But in the midst of the project, it did become open source. So we appreciated his input as we started to run our own repo simulations. He was at UC Riverside and is now a postdoc at UT Austin. Okay, so I'm also happy to take any questions about how the project and the interdisciplinary collaboration went, but we can save those for the Q&A, and I won't really discuss that in the talk itself. So our methodology, first we wanted to figure out, we have our two codes that we want to compare. We need to give them the same initial conditions. And fortunately for us, our two codes actually came from the same family of code. And so they each take in very similar kinds of initial conditions. So we could generate our initial conditions with this code called spheric, and the output of spheric could be piped into both Gizmo and a repo. So that was really straightforward for us, and we didn't have to really change anything in the codes in order to adopt the same initial conditions. Then the outputs of Gizmo and a repo were also really similar, and we could just use a simple Python plotting script in order to analyze the results. So unlike the Agora project, we didn't have to design our own analysis platform on which to incorporate many different codes as outputs. They were actually really similar, and so we could use a simple Python script. In terms of what we wanted to compare, there were a few things that we knew we wanted to compare, but then there were also a few things that as we did the project, we learned that certain comparisons would be fruitful and unfruitful. And so some of these we knew going in, and others of them we came to as we did it, but I wouldn't consider it an ad hoc methodology, because it wasn't as though we had some comparisons and threw them out in favor of others. Rather, it was more like we were learning what would be the most fruitful kind of comparison as we went. The ones that we thought were most interesting by the end, so we have a general comparison about the convergence of each of the codes. a comparison about the resolution and what happens as you increase and decrease the resolution of the simulations. We wanted to look at the sensitivity of each code to the self-interacting dark matter interaction cross-section, the main thing that cosmologists are kind of trying to figure out with respect to these simulations. And then finally, a sensitivity comparison to code-specific SIDM parameters. And I'll discuss that in a bit, in just a second. Okay, so those were the main comparisons we knew we wanted to run. Let me now describe some of the results of those comparisons. So as I mentioned, we could use spheric as our initial conditions generator. So what we wanted to do was adopt a really simple case. So we have an isolated halo, and it's a dwarf galaxy, so it's quite small and dense. And we were using one from this catalog provided by a previous member of the research group, of the cosmology research group. The spheric is going to generate a profile for us, a density profile. And we're going to, I've put up various parameters there, but basically for the resolution test, it'll be important that we have 1 million dark matter particles for our baseline simulations. And then when we want to look at high resolution simulations, we adopt 5 million particles. The plots, what I'm showing here is the top one is the density at various radii of the dark matter dwarf halo. So as you're at the center of the dwarf halo, the density is really high. And then as you move out, the density starts to drop. The bottom plot is the velocity dispersion. So it kind of plots up the velocity of the particles within the halo itself. And there it looks like a hill. So it kind of peaks more towards like 2/3 of the way out of the halo. The two different lines are the fiducial or the baseline resolution and then the high resolution. Okay. So now I'll go through some other plots and I'll cover the most important results at the end again. So I'll kind of summarize it up at the end, but for now I'll go through the plots. So here we have more plots of the density and at various radii of each of these halos. The cold dark matter, which is not with no self interactions, is in black. And then the solid versus dashed indicates whether it's a baseline or a high resolution. On the left panel, we have the gizmo plots, and on the right panel, we have the arepo plots. And I'm showing it at 3 different time steps. So the first one's at 2 million years, the second row is at 5 million years, and the third row is at 10 million years. So it's kind of showing an evolution. And so what you'll notice is that every other color is dropping underneath the cold dark matter. And that's what we want, because we want to be able to take the inner energy of the halo and move it outwards. And by dropping the inner density, we're kind of moving some of that energy out. And the idea there is as dark matter particles collide with one another, they'll kind of distribute the energy a little bit more evenly in the halo. Okay, and then the different colors here. So the blue is with the cross-section 1, the light blue is with cross-section 5, and the green is with cross-section 50. So the more you increase the cross-section, the more self-interactions you get, and the more the inner density falls. And then the final line, the vertical dotted line going through it, basically anything inside of that, we didn't have enough particles to resolve. So it would be on the order of 5 to 20 particles. And so it wasn't fine enough for us to resolve it, but anything outside of that, we have pretty good confidence in. Okay. Now I want to show the, if you just look at the 50 centimeters squared per gram cross-section and compare the gizmo versus arepo results, what you get is these plots that look really similar to one another, like the lines are almost on top of each other. The only time they come apart is when you start looking at really late time, so 10 million years, and you compare the gizmo low resolution with everything else. So it seems like a repo has already resolved itself or converged at low resolution, but Gizmo is still converging. And so the 1 million particles might not be enough for Gizmo to be sufficiently converged at with this cross-section for self-interacting dark matter. Okay, and then in this plot, what we're trying to show is that if you were to increase the resolution, you would actually bring the codes into better agreement. So similar to the previous one, and here we have, again, the density and the velocity dispersion plots. And for the density, the solid is Gizmo and the dashed is a repo, but the top plot is the high resolution and the bottom plot is the low resolution. And so the distance between the Gizmo and the repo lines is shrinking as you have higher resolution. And that's what it means to bring them into better agreement. Okay, and then almost through the plots. Here, actually, let's ignore the left one. I'll just draw your attention to the right plot. So in this plot, what we're showing is the difference between the two codes when you look at, you pick a specific spot on the halo. So we chose 300 parsecs, like distance into the halo. And then we looked at what the density was at 300 parsecs for each of the comparisons. So a repo minus Gizmo over Gizmo. So the difference between Gizmo and a repo at that radius. And then for each of the cross sections, we've plotted it through time. So time is on our x-axis. And so here, I think what is most significant is that everything is largely within the 20% range. The only thing that seems like it really goes pretty far outside of 20% is the 5 centimeters squared per gram line. That's the light blue one. And it goes up to 40, but largely it stays below 30 before like 7 to 8 million years. Okay, and here's the last one. So each of these codes have different self-interacting dark matter parameters that they use. As I mentioned for a repo, it's the number of neighbors that it looks at. So we tried to see what would happen if we increased or decreased the number of neighbors and whether the results would be stable if we did that. So for a repo, we dropped it down to 16 and bumped it up to 64 from the standard 32. For Gizmo, it's the smoothing factor, which is the self-interacting dark matter parameter. So we also varied that. So we took it down and up. The plot itself is showing what the difference between the baseline and then if you were to increase or decrease these values would be. And again, the significant thing to draw your attention to is that everything is within 20%. And then if you look like slightly outside of that radius where we start trusting the results, things start to look much more on the order of 5 to 10%. Okay, so let me summarize these results. Firstly, increasing the resolution from 1 to 5 million particles brought the results of the two simulation codes into better agreement. Second, increasing the self-interacting dark matter cross-section, both the codes flattened out the density and the velocity dispersion profiles in the innermost region of the halo. I didn't show a plot of this, but the number of self-interactions in the codes scaled linearly with the cross-section. So as you increase the cross-section, the number of self-interactions proportionally increased as well. Changing the code-specific self-interacting dark matter parameters changed the inner halo profile somewhat, but there was no general trend in when we increased or decreased these parameters. And then what I think is the main and crucial takeaway was that the degree of agreement between these codes, I think it was largely on the order of 30%, as in there was the halo profiles were within 30% of one another. The degree of agreement is smaller than what can be observationally constrained. In other words, the observations that cosmologists are taking and the systematic errors that they come with are not precise enough to detect the degree of difference that we find between the two codes. So the differences between the results of the two codes for any particular cross-section, say 1 versus 5 versus 50, were much smaller than the differences between the various cross-sections tested. Sorry, I kind of said that backwards, but differences between the codes, if you were to select a cross-section and then compare them, would be smaller than if you were to compare the 1 versus 5 versus 50 in one of the codes. Okay. So finally, this brings me to the philosophical reflections on the code comparison methodology. And I'll start with the Leonard and Winsberg point about having fuzzy modular codes and then them being kludged together, leading to holistic confirmation. So I think these two codes would qualify as fuzzy modular on their definition. They're both gravitational solvers at their core, but they can implement loads of other physics. So they can do hydrodynamics, magnetic fields, radiative heating, cooling, etc. When those modules are turned on, they're in continual interaction with the gravitational physics solver and with one another. So they're continuously sending data to each of the other modules. So they're definitely modular, and I think they also would fit the fuzzy modularity definition. The history of the development of these codes, given that they're both derived from the same code, and there have been all these patches and various different groups working on them, and the group doing the self-interacting dark matter is a different group than the group that originally developed the codes. All of this suggests to me that insofar as climate models have been kludged together, these two codes have been kludged together as well. There's no principal difference between the kinds of climate models they're looking at and these codes. So I think we qualify for the first two, but I don't actually think that we saw holistic confirmation in this case. So I think the reason is that we were still able to test the self-interacting dark matter module in isolation. And that was only because each code is a gravity solver at its core, and that's the thing that we were testing. So these particles interacting with one another and whether or not they have self-interactions, that's part of the underlying gravity solver. And so my thought here is you can have these two codes that are fuzzy, that exhibit fuzzy modularity and seem to be kludged together, but you can actually resist holistic confirmation if you're able to really get at the heart of what the codes are talking about. You can sort of bypass any kind of fuzzy modularity worries that might have arisen otherwise. Okay, so now let me talk about how this relates to Marie Guegouen's original argument against code comparisons. So recall that she was trying to argue for code comparison methodology as a way of testing whether a code was going to be artifact free. But I think that perhaps that was too strong for at least some code comparison projects. Instead, I'm going to suggest that we not aim for robustness analysis when we're talking about code comparison, but instead we aim for eliminative reasoning. And this comes from a paper by Chris Fink and Sarah Gallagher from 2020. They say, to establish the reliability of a simulation or any type of inquiry, we need to identify possible sources of error and avoid them. It's obviously unwise to rely on a single simulation given our limited understanding of how its success in a particular domain can be generalized. Robustness helps to counter such over-reliance. But there are many other strategies that simulators have used to identify sources of error and to rule them out. First, we have to ask, what are the different sources of error that could be relevant? And what is the best case one can make to rule out competing accounts? And so what they cash this out as a kind of eliminative reasoning where you identify the sources of error and rule them out or eliminate them. Okay, so one way of doing this is by benchmarking, and that's a thing that a lot of practitioners will be doing. So you benchmark against previous results that you do trust. Another way of doing this is these crucial experiments that Marie Gueguen has also discussed. So here the idea is you set up some kind of idealized scenario in which the physical hypothesis can be tested against a numerical hypothesis, and you're able to really isolate some key hypothesis that you want to test out. But besides these, I think another method you can use for eliminative reasoning is code comparison. And I hope I've shown how it can do that. So you can identify the sources of error and rule them out. And in our case, that was the self-interacting dark matter modules, if those had any kinds of errors. Okay, so if we adopt that as our main aim for doing a code comparison, I will argue that we can satisfy the comparability and diversity requirement. And the way we do that is because we radically restricted our scope. We were only looking at the self-interacting dark matter modules, not the codes as a whole. And then finally, this allowed our code comparison to establish that differences between implementations of self-interactions in the two codes did not contribute meaningfully to the results. And so it would not be a meaningful source of error that would matter for the eliminative reasoning. Now, you might ask, well, what if you did want to say whether or not you've ruled out that there are any artifacts in the code? I don't think that our methodology was sufficiently strong to rule out whether there are any artifacts in the code. I think that trying to show that the code is artifact-free involves a whole slew of methods, code comparison being one of them, but you might also set up more crucial experiments, look at the history of the development of these codes, etc., and then try to argue that it's artifact-free. But as it stands, like in isolation, this code comparison did not establish that kind of thing. So definitely bite the bullet with respect to that stronger thesis. Okay, so that brings me to my conclusion. So code comparisons can be really fruitful, especially when they're thought of as part of a larger methodology of eliminative reasoning and used in conjunction with other kinds of methods. Thank you all so much for listening.